Hello, everyone. I am Max Grinnell, author and urbanologist, here to talk to you about video games about Chicago. Very excited to be back again for this year of programmings with Chicago Public Library, and in support of the wonderful One Book, One Chicago program. One of the things that intrigued me about these series is thinking about Chicago has been such a center of the gaming industry for such a long time. And also thinking about how those external representations of Chicago in video games informs our understanding of the city, and also how outsiders have chosen which parts of Chicago have they chosen to talk about, both in terms of cultural history, the urban landscape, and of course, not surprisingly, because these are video games, thinking about alternate visions of Chicago, kind of in the creator's mind's eye. So, really excited to be here with all of you today, and thanks for joining me for this program. One thing is certain, Chicagoans have always played games. The video part is actually fairly recent. And as I was doing my research, digging through both newspaper archives and other materials from various area institutions, interesting article that I found refers to in the spring of 1951, the Chicago Tribune refers to a college football game being played by Northwestern versus Michigan that would be shown as a video game. So, even in the early 1950s, you would have people referring to things shown via projection as a video game. Of course, then as now, you can't interrupt or interfere, hopefully, with the performance on the field. That was just kind of one of those interesting little tidbits of information that I learned as I started the research project for that, referring to these television programs as video games because they were shown by a video projection. So along with softball, baseball, soccer, basketball, football, and countless other physical pursuits, there have been dozens of companies throughout Chicago's history that have made mechanical games and other devices to challenge people's motor skills, visual acumen, and problem-solving abilities. Kind of an interesting backstory to all this in terms of the actual history of video games or standalone arcade video games. The first one was called Computer Space. It was actually released in 1971, and it was created by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney, working with a group called Citizen Engineering to create this kind of standalone video experience. And one of the things I think one of the creators, Nolan Bushnell, in a newspaper article in 1971 noted, he said, "It's people's opportunity to beat a computer." And I think as we think about how much games have changed, especially in the last couple of decades, with these kind of multiplayer online environments, sure, you're playing against other humans, but really at the end of the day, it is this opportunity to beat a computer, which I think is pretty interesting. So if we think about Chicago's, one of the most famous products of Chicago's gaming industry, entertainment industry, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about pinball. And certainly the fact that Stern Pinball, the company, is still based in nearby Elk Grove Village, gives a lot of credence and support to this claim that Chicago still can be seen as one of the centers of the pinball gaming industry. And an interesting little wrinkle, what we're looking at right now is a 1974 publicity shot from Bally Games to promote some of their new pinball machines. And this photograph was actually assembled at the Merchandise Mart in one of the showrooms, and they got folks who worked in the mart to come and be stand-ins for this rather amazing publicity photo. But Chicago has also had a difficult relationship with pinball games. From the late 1930s into the late 1970s, playing pinball in the city was technically illegal by decree of the city council. An Illinois Supreme Court case decision in the 1930s declared that pinball machines were actually gaming or gambling devices because they involved an element of risk. So for decades, despite the fact that Chicago had three major pinball companies, including Midway and Bally, there was a real uneasy tension about having these video games in public places. And of course, one of those things that we think about is, kind of the introduction of new technologies, new devices, whether it's your iPhone, whether it's a new streaming channel, whether it's something else like TikTok. There was a lot of concern that young people, this would just be another time waster. So an interesting contradiction, because of course, Chicago was such a vibrant center of activity in video game production. Interestingly enough, if you are intrigued, there from time to time, Stern Pinball still does occasionally have open houses, and you come visit them. And my understanding from what I've read is that they have, like many other companies, a huge growth market abroad in places like China and other rapidly growing countries. So, but it's interesting to think that a lot of this really started right here in Chicago as a precursor to these other video games. One of the other really big movers in this field, and if you think about all the industry and manufacturing that began to dominate Chicago in the decades after the Great Fire, was the Exhibit Supply Company. This kind of, anodyne name, you might ask yourself, what are we supplying? What are we exhibiting? The company was started in the South Loop in 1901 by a fellow who had arrived from Peoria with an interest in mechanical engineering. And in this Gilded Age period in Chicago and other places, there was a lot of interest, some of it drawn from folks who had visited the Midway, the section of amusements and entertainments at the Columbian Exposition, was how can we make more of these devices for an urbanized public that was looking to be entertained? And if you think about in 2024, how many ways in which we can be entertained, this was near approaching kind of the top of the pinnacle as the supply company continued to grow throughout the first couple of decades of the 20th century. And as this 1929 company brochure indicates, you can see at the top right, they had a large manufacturing facility on the west side on Lake Street. Two of their most popular selling devices during this time period was both the palmistry fortune teller and Cupid's post office, which, as the the text reads, it is a continual source of innocent and pleasing amusement. The popularity of Cupid is as old as the song, I got my letter from my love. Whether young or old, men, women, and children never pass by without paying Cupid for one of his cleverly written love messages. I don't know how many kids were sending love messages, but it's kind of an interesting to think about. You would put in a coin, and you would receive a love letter. So you wouldn't have to write your own. And of course, fortune telling, that has been popular for millennia. So that is another kind of clear winner for the Exhibit Supply Company. And the vastness and scope of their industry is rather hard to kind of fathom, because it was, in fact, they made thousands of these machines. And as video games and pinball games would come to dominate this aspect of the entertainment game business, these were all over the place, right? You would find them in train stations like LaSalle Street Station and the Loop. You would find them in bus terminals. You would find them in pool halls, taverns, etc. And they did not have an element of chance or skill. So these were much more lightly regulated and did not cause as much of a moral panic as pinball games and video game arcades would do decades later. Another interesting aspect of their business operations was the creation of what were called digger machines, or what we sometimes know as iron claws. So the idea that you would manipulate either a bulldozer or some sort of other mechanical accoutrement to obtain a prize. And probably most of you have seen these in bowling alleys, arcades, and other places of amusement. And the Exhibit Supply Company was one of the early innovators in working on these iron claw machines. And you can see, not cheap in the least. The price of the improved model on the left-hand side of the screen, $150. So definitely not a cheap investment for a business owner, so on and so forth. And of course, as the text on the left-hand side reads, more and more of the large progressive operators are securing territory and successful installing iron claws in recreation centers, dance halls, terminal stations, resorts, and chain stores. And interestingly enough, the exhibit supply company had a long-standing relationship with Walgreens Company, another Chicago original. So they were really keen on placing these in high pedestrian traffic areas, which makes sense, of course. More people coming by and depositing their 5 cents, um, and possibly winning a prize. Well, we come to our, if not the first game that looks at Chicago, one of the earliest games I came across during my research was Airmail Pilot. And if you think about Chicago's role in the aviation industry and also formerly three major airports, this all kind of makes sense. And Airmail Pilot was first released in 1979 on a format that may be a little less familiar with younger viewers, on cassette tape. And the initial price in 1979 was $9.95. And to run this game, to play this flight simulator, you would need to have a Tandy Radio Shack TRS-80. The price of this impressive computing device in 1979 was $599. Today, that would be around $3,000. So certainly not a very cheap investment if you are interested in playing the Airmail Pilot game. As the text indicates, every flight is a special delivery, and the focus of the game was moving a J-4 Jenny biplane, which if you've ever seen a movie about World War I and the subsequent periods, you've probably seen one of these. And as the text indicates, you can almost smell the gasoline as the ground crew fuels your J-4 Jenny biplane to her 26-gallon limit. Precious mail is loaded into the cargo area, tagged for Chicago. So there's a big block of text describing what you can look forward to. So here's the big reveal of what these graphics would have looked like in 1979. Someone saw this and they were used to playing Microsoft's latest flight simulator, they might be disappointed. And interestingly enough, the intro screen to the game starts with an advertisement, a fictional advertisement for July 18th, 1922, which says, "Wanted, airmail pilot for the Columbus to Chicago run. Must be willing to fly in every type of weather." How was the game reviewed, you might be thinking, because this is the early days of video game magazines that would specifically review video games and various platforms, etc. So writing in Space Gamer number 36, Bruce Campbell said, "If you are looking for a realistic air flight simulation, Airmail Pilot is not for you. Since its price is on the lower end of the software spectrum, I do recommend it for those looking for a quick, easy, enjoyable game with limited staying power." Another reviewer later in the same issue, two people reviewing this game, commented, "It can be fun and amusing, but it is not designed to hold an adult's attention for very long." And there would be a few more years before Chicago's landscape would be more accurately rendered with the development of claymation and more advanced graphics, and of course, the computers and entertainment systems to help play those graphics. I was interested to see as well when Chicago papers, what else were they saying about during these early games, video games, and I came across the January 1, 1982 editorial cartoon from longtime Chicago Tribune editorial cartoonist Wayne Stayskull. And as you will note, the text at the bottom reads, "It followed me home from the video game arcade. Can I keep him?" That would be a fun pet. One can imagine that you probably wouldn't have to feed uh, that digital character very much. So that's the first appearance, interestingly enough, of a video game or video game character to appear in the Chicago Tribune. There was a lot of concern by the early 1980s about young people playing too many video games, going to arcades, which were dark and noisy. What were people doing? Who would people meet? Once again, this kind of a little bit of moral panic. So what I located for us is a 1982 clip from a Coronado, California town hall meeting that presents both sides, shall we say.
Pac-Man, Space Invaders. They won't be fighting villains from outer space or ghosts in certain parts of Coronado. This afternoon, both those in favor and opposed to a new ordinance that restricts where and how many video games will be allowed in that city squared off before the city council.
I have read a number of newspaper articles. I've seen a number of comments on television, and I don't think there's any question that these games are addictive. I think they distract the students from homework and school.
It keeps us off the streets, and it does really. And would you want us to go break windows in cheesy houses or something like that? Or maybe I think it keeps us off the streets.
The new ordinance restricts the number of video games allowed in the neighborhood commercial districts to 4 or fewer games, although businesses in other, more commercial areas will be permitted more games.
Lauren and Carol, News 8.
Well, folks would not have to wait long for a new video game or simulator to experience a little bit of Chicago's landscape. The Microsoft Corporation, which for a number of years since its founding had been interested in creating a flight simulator and a very popular consumer-oriented video game experience, first came up with the idea, and Flight Simulator, the first edition, Flight Simulator 1.0, was released for the IBM in 1982. And one of the signature or default fields that was used was Meigs Field. So one of the things that had always kind of intrigued the folks who had worked on the flight simulator was looking for an airport just like this, where you would have the approach, landing, and takeoff near a major American city. And of course, Meigs Field, for many decades, until its removal in 2005, really fit the bill. Now, what we're looking at right now is the most recent edition of Flight Simulator. And what I'd like to do is take you through a little bit of how the appearance look changed over the decades. There you have Flight Simulator 1.0, which given you have, of course, the control panels, elevation, flaps, etc. There you have, if you were taking off from Meigs Field in 1982, this is what you would have seen. But never fear, things improved fairly quickly. By Flight Simulator 3.0 in 1988, released on 5 different platforms, you have a few more buildings, and obviously with the improvement in graphics, there's some green indicating grass and a few more prominent structures. In the far distance, you can see the planetarium. 1995, things have improved even more. There's a more granular detail throughout the loop, North Michigan Avenue, and you would probably recognize this as Chicago. It would be hard to imagine for this Flight Simulator 2004 things getting much better, but you do even have more detail throughout. In the far distance on the right side of the screen, you can make out Navy Pier and the Navy Pier Ballroom, along with the planetarium, and of course On our left, on the left side of the plane, the details are even more rich. And Flight Simulator, in its various iterations, remains one of the most popular video games ever released, and certainly was another way in which people, whether they were in Beijing or another part of the world, could experience a little bit of Chicago. And probably most people familiar with the history of video games have probably encountered someone who said, "Oh, yeah, I've flown into Chicago." Well, where'd you go? Meigs Field. So, pretty neat to think about. Well, there's a lot of interesting games that feature Chicago as a character. And probably one of the more interesting games I've found is the 1986 graphic adventure known as Bugs or Bugsy, the King of Chicago. And as you will see, this is a rabbit with a Tommy gun. And of course, we are in the Roaring Twenties, which, as I did kind of look through all these materials, you'll find that the Roaring Twenties is a very popular time in which to set video games about Chicago, which is probably surprising to no one. The backstory of this game is also very intriguing. We'll get to that in a second as well. One of the intro title screens, and you can also play this video game on the Internet Archive, archive.org. Even just going there and typing in the words Chicago video game will reveal a number of the things that we've talked about today. So the objective of the game is to be a successful criminal. It's primarily a text-based game with some graphical elements. The thing that I want you to pay attention to is that the words where it says written by St. Bride's School. Okay, so you're probably thinking to yourself, is this a primary school, high school, fine arts academy? The St. Bride's School was in fact a communitarian feminist collective that moved into a farmhouse in Ireland in the early 1980s. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, what's going on here? Two people, one of the women who's still alive, wanted to create a feminist collective where women could return to Victorian ideals. So certainly an unusual setting, you might say, for video games to arise from. Like, what was the situation? The apocryphal legend was that one of the new arrivals to the St. Bride's School in Ireland brought her Commodore 64 with her and found the only working outlet and plugged it in. And she also had a rudimentary text-based game creation software, an early format of this. So it seems unlikely. And since that time, many people who have been in the kind of commune collective have declined to give interviews about the subject. But that's the backstory behind this. There weren't people from Chicago, trying to celebrate an aspect of the city's history. They were trying to create these text-based adventure games, and they successfully created a handful of them during their short time in existence. And that's how they bankrolled some of their operation, which is the creation of these games. The controls are pretty straightforward. I mean, the backstory behind the game is really something else, but this is how the game starts. It is an ordinary evening in the common room at St. Bride's. Girls are sipping a cozy supper time cup of cocoa. In one corner, a quiet game of poker is in progress, while at the little table, Trixie Trinan is writing about her adventures in the very big caves in the hope of selling them to a Sunday paper. Suddenly, the door bursts open and a rabbit staggers in. It is pale blue. This is the opening screen of the game. Chicago, 1922. Street full of bars and pool halls. Shot in sepia. Very atmospheric, I'm outside Devaney's bar. Street leads east and west. And, for folks, Gen Xers like myself who grew up playing these text-based games, you would have to hunt and back throughout terms. There was no quote dictionary or concordance of these things. You'd have to say, go east, talk to nearby stranger, so on and so forth. And of course, if you didn't use the exact syntax, etc., that the game understood, you were basically out of luck. or you'd have to ask a friend who also played the game. So the story behind the St. Bride School undoubtedly more interesting than the actual game, which I've played for a few minutes, and you can check out at your leisure online. And there have been a couple pieces written about the kind of the backstory of St. Bride's as this 2-page or it's part of a 4-page spread from a British gaming magazine asks, how did an old house offering a 1920s girl boarding school experience become an outlet for some of the most creatively enterprising text adventures on Commodore 64? Definitely worth something reading about, and if you're kind of interested in this history, certainly now today, of course, video games, it's big business. It's not to say there aren't smaller players involved, but certainly the backstory behind this particular Chicago focused game is really something else. Well, we'd be remiss unless we talked about one of my favorite games growing up, which is 1986, The King of Chicago. And it was part of the vast Cinemaware empire, which gave us games about medieval England, 1950s atomic era adventures in the American Southwest. So a really wide range of games came out of the Cinemaware company. This particular game, when it was released, was interesting because it actually used claymation for the Macintosh version, while some of the other ones would utilize actually various drawn graphics. So there's kind of a little bit of innovative spirit in the King of Chicago. And essentially, the game starts, you're a small mafia type mobster, and you're trying to follow Al Capone to be the next mob king of Chicago. Title screen says something probably many people have thought of over the decades. Politicians are a gangster's best friend. So the game features a lot of different mobster activities. Some of the, I don't want to say classics, but some of the tried and true favorites, perhaps. Drive-by shootings, bombings, illegal gambling, and bribing of corrupt government officials. Well, the mid to late 80s were a great time for Chicago on video games as a setting. One of my favorites, certainly to play in the arcade version, was 1986 Rampage. The basic premise of the game, which is created by someone from the Chicagoland area, was that you, along with a variety of other monsters, multiple players, would be dropped into various cities around the Midwest and beyond. The game starts in Peoria, Illinois, of all places, and the objective was to, using your fists and other powers, physical powers, etc., the idea was to destroy the city. Kind of a whimsical, cartoon, graphical vibe to it. Nothing too violent, as it were. And what you might say is stylized cartoon violence. Since now, of course, video games have ratings, which at the time Rampage came out, they did not rate video games. And while the game has gone through several iterations, it has also jumped formats. And in 2018, the Rampage movie came out, starring Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and a other cast of luminaries, and a whole lot of CGI. So what I'm going to show you next, the 5-minute clip that takes a look at when these monsters from Rampage start to converge on the loop. The one bit of little context I'll provide for the background is that you will note a Dave and Buster's sign on the side of the Renaissance Chicago Hotel at State and Wacker, and that's probably one of my favorite bits of product placement in this movie. There, of course, is no Dave and Buster's there. So let us take a moment and see what these creatures do when they arrive in Chicago.
Status report. Where's Warthog 1?
Inbound, sir.
Warthog 1, you are cleared on. Roger that. This is Warthog 1, targets missed. Lobo X-ray requests come back around for another run.
Warthog 1, this is Black Dog 6 actual. Hit him again.
Roger that.
Kaplan, where are we with the evacuation?
50% downtown, sir.
Sir, we have a bogey headed north in the river, half-mile out.
What the hell are you talking about? Is that a ship?
It's underwater, sir.
We don't have any subs in the area.
Davis, there's something big in the river.
Well, that sucks.
Direct all forces at that thing now!
They can't stop them. We gotta get that antidote.
Well, I don't mind telling you, my friends, that as that clip concludes, those monsters do converge on Sears Tower. So you'll have to watch the rest of it to find out what happens. 1985's Deja Vu, released for the Macintosh, was one of the most successful point-and-click graphical interface games released around this time period. The basic concept was it takes place in Chicago during December 1941, and the primary character featured here is Theodore Ace Harding, a retired boxer working as a private eye. Unfortunately, Ace awakens one morning in a bathroom stall, unable to remember who he is. So seriously, we could call this a nightmare that comes true. The game was widely praised. There are a series of puzzles and other challenges as Ace makes his way around Chicago. This is just one sample of kind of screenshot from the gameplay. You can see, you can look through inventory, what Ace has on his person. There's a series of basic commands: examine, open, close, speak, operate, go, hit, consume. And this is, basically about how you navigate the entire experience. And Macworld said it was one of the top 10 games released during that year. So certainly a game that was very well received when it was released. Well, we'd be remiss unless we talked about this next game, which was not terribly successful. But it does hew to a long-standing tradition of games based on other material. It was very, very common to think about ways in which you could extend the life and perhaps the marketability of a movie. Maybe some of you are familiar with 1988's Red Heat, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jim Belushi, a buddy cop movie. And the game itself, which was based loosely on the movie's play, featured a variety of games for folks who would experience this. One of the games has you breaking apart a hot rock using only Donko's hand. Donko is played by Arnold Schwarzenegger. In another game, a player must put a torn dollar bill together. This game was not well reviewed. It did not do well, despite the movie's general popularity, pairing of that kind of classic buddy cop movie. And it was pretty universally panned when the game came out. So perhaps not the best version of Chicago in a video game, but one of the more intriguing ones. Certainly, the next year's game, the 1990 game, The Untouchables, was much more well received, both in terms of its gameplay and overall kind of experience, because it featured some of the scenes and the settings from the original movie. One good example of this was the series of sub-games. There are games that take place on bridges over the Chicago River. There's games in a warehouse. There's time in the train station. Probably most of you remember the train station scene from that celebrated movie. And one of the most popular segments was navigating through the warehouse. And this was, interestingly enough, The Untouchables received several awards from publications later on in the early 90s as being one of the best games of the early 90s. So certainly, and you can see some of the stylized graphics and typefaces in this particular screenshot from gameplay. It was predominantly a scroller. So you would make your way through those landscapes like that, and remains one of the most popular video games featuring Chicago as a location. Well, Death Race is certainly, and Death Race was developed initially for the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, and released in 1990. As the game name suggests, the idea is that you are driving an armored sports car around a variety of cities, including Chicago, Louisiana, Chicago, New Orleans, Houston, and so on. And of course, the objective is to destroy the bad guys using ground-to-air missiles and any variety of other weapons. The interesting thing about Death Race was that it was based on an arcade video game from 1976. And while Chicago is featured in a location in here, what is also very interesting is that this game would go on to inspire Grand Theft Auto. So it's kind of sits in the middle of these two different gaming experiences. And of course, Grand Theft Auto continues to be one of the most popular ongoing video game franchises. So interesting to think about how these different games and properties sometimes have new life breathed into them over time by other creative artists and video game designers as well. Well, so as we move into the early 1990s, there's one Chicagoan, or maybe former Chicagoan, who looms large. And that, of course, is Michael Jordan. Interestingly enough, when this game was starting to be developed in late 1994, of course, this is during a time period when Michael Jordan had taken a brief break from the Chicago Bulls in the NBA. And so they were looking, him and his agents and other folks who managed kind of, his likeness and so on and so forth, were looking for a video game. And in 1995, you would have, excuse me, at the end of 1994, Michael Jordan, Chaos in the Windy City would be released first for the NES, and then for other formats following, like the Sega Genesis Entertainment System. So the gameplay was kind of like a lot of other side-scrolling games of the time. Michael Jordan, the basic premise was that um, these players that had been assembled for an all-star game had been stolen by a mad scientist. And who better than number 23? Of course, you couldn't use number 23 at the time in the game. You could use Michael Jordan's likeness to rescue these fellow all-stars and reunite them through a series of gameplay challenges. This is a print ad that appeared in one of the industry magazines in advance of the game's release. Gives us a nice little summary. Michael Jordan has been keeping mighty busy since hanging up his Chicago Bulls jersey. First, he took on baseball's minor leagues, and soon he'll be up against a psychotic scientist in Michael Jordan and Chaos in the Windy City from Electronic Arts, pitting Chicago's hero against the mechanized forces of Dr. Max Cranium. Perfect. Who's abducted all the other great basketball players of the world. Armed with only his basketball, Jordan will try to slam jam and outshoot the forces of evil. Can he make the world safe for athletes everywhere? He may have left the Bulls, but he still knows a thing or two about basketball. Book opens, or the video game opens, with a series of kind of comic strip styled illustrations. It's a windy day in Chicago. First practice for an all-star charity game. Michael shows up and finds his team has disappeared. Next, MJ, a dramatic crash. The glass breaks and a basketball enters the room. Mr. Jordan, if you want to save your pals, come to the Egyptian room in the Field Museum at midnight. Come alone. So essentially, Michael Jordan makes his way through the city. It's probably one of my favorite stylized maps of Chicago. You can see Wrigley Field, United Center, the old CNA building, Buckingham Fountain, and other buildings along the Mag Mile. MJ makes his way to these various stops and using a series of basketballs. There's like an icy basketball. There's a basketball that's on fire, defeating all these henchmen along the way to retrieve all of the players for the big game. Well, the game wasn't reviewed very well in the Chicago Tribune or anywhere else. I pulled this out from the December 22nd, 1994 Metro print edition of the Chicago Tribune. By this point, the Tribune had started reviewing video games. You can see this screen. Dennis Lynch reviewed first a game I've never heard of, Sanctuary Woods, which is where you play a wolf. Sounds fascinating. Not many games, I think, then or now allowed you to play an actual wolf. Near the end of the piece, he weighs in. Wish that I could report the same news after a favorable review about the Wolf Simulator about good old number 23. Unfortunately, Michael Jordan Chaos in the Windy City, $59.95, is a disappointing video game that pits MJ in a generic plot against an evil genius. You have to wonder what's going on at Electronic Arts. With the license to create games starring the world's greatest athlete, they've produced two duds. Ouch. Last year's Jordan in Flight, and now this. Recommended only for MJ's youngest fans. A game that was not very well received. And other commentators said, well, this is just kind of a waste of a license, using Michael Jordan's tremendous charisma and athletic ability for a subpar video game experience. I say this as a former Amtrak employee, full disclosure, but I love Railfan. Railfan's story is pretty interesting. Not a lot of rail simulators. This was created by a Japanese company, first released in 2006 for the PlayStation 3. And they used three above ground transit lines, two in Japan and one with the permission of the Chicago Transit Authority to shoot along the brown line. So the gameplay is, essentially you're controlling the brown line and other train lines, and you get to experience a little bit of the city that way. So what I like to do is show you a little clip. And once again, it was pretty interesting that this company got access via Chicago Transit Authority to film along the brown line right of way. So we're going to start off at the Fullerton stop, and we'll show you a little bit as the train heads south to Sedgwick.
Doors closing. Armitage is next. Doors open on the right at Armitage. Soliciting on CTA trains is prohibited. Violators will be arrested. This is Armitage. This is a brown line train. Doors closing. Sedgwick is next. Doors open on the right at Sedgwick. Priority seating is intended for the elderly and passengers with disabilities. More cooperation is requested. This is Sedgwick. This is a Brown Line train.
I suppose the next frontier of CTA simulators is to have a game that's focused on the inside of the train, perhaps. That's something I would certainly look forward to. We've gone through, shall we say, a selective history of video games featuring Chicago as a location, an idea, place with a very rich history to be explored and expanded upon. And what I wanted to conclude with today is the folks who are doing a lot of interesting work to kind of celebrate video games. And one organization that comes to mind, and there are many others out there, I encourage you all to seek them out, is Chicago Game Space. I had the good fortune to stop by for the first time a few weeks ago over on West Bloomingdale, conveniently located to many mass transit options, etc. And you can stop by every Sunday from 1 to 5 and check out a little bit of their video game arcade collection, learn a little bit about the history of video games. And they also have a very nice gift shop. So another way to kind of think about this gaming history and, of course, how it plays out in the current day. And of course, there are many other things in the last few years. Folks have probably noticed the concept of a barcade. A bar and a video game arcade has become quite popular. There's several in places like Logan Square. And I think there is a kind of a sense of communion around playing video games with other folks and close physically proximate to other people that I think people still seek out, along with all the vast number of opportunities to play video games on your phone or on the convenience of your own home or even while you are in transit. I want to thank you all for joining me for my talk today. You've been a wonderful audience, and hope to see you in the future at one of my One Book, One Chicago programs.